Hello, I'm Michael O'Keefe, aka The Movie Mystic. If you enjoy this interview, please subscribe to the channel as I release high-quality film industry interviews every 2 days. Thank you, and be well. Eric Homenick. Before we talk today about Japanese film composer Akira Ifukube, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Eric Homenick, and currently I am a PhD student in literature at the University of California, San Diego. And I am also the webmaster of a website about the composer of whom we are going to be speaking today, Akira Ifukube. The name of the website is akiraifukube.org. It is an officially sanctioned online resource about the composer. I am very fortunate that the late composer's family, the late composer's estate, has given me the privilege to work on the history and life of their father in an authorized way. And on that website, probably the main attraction of that website is I'm working on the first ever English language biography, comprehensive biography of the composer. The biography is a work in progress. It's not quite done yet there. You can go look at it. It's basically a rough draft that you can go look at for an eventual book that I hope to publish about him one day. So once the biography on the website is completed, I will seek to send it off to a publisher should they be interested, and get the thing published as an actual book. But in the meantime, if you're curious about his life, you can go to the website and read the biography as it stands now there.
Well, that's super cool, and it's interesting to see a work in progress. It's interesting to see a work in progress like that.
It's a little unusual. I think when people are writing something, they don't usually let everyone go and read the draft of it.
Mm-hmm.
They wait for the thing to be finished. It's interesting though, because I never actually had the intention that it would be a book. I just wanted to write his biography and get the information out there. It never occurred to me that I should publish it as a book. I thought perhaps the most easy and efficient way to get information about the man out there was this way. But over the years, I've had a lot of support from people and people pushing me. Eric, yeah, you should turn that into a book one day. I really see this as a book at some point. So, at some point a few years ago, I decided, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing on the website, but then eventually, when it's done, see if I can't turn it into a book. So we'll see what happens with that.
Very groovy. So typically, when people write, biographies on other people, they tend to like the person. They think they had, maybe in this case, a great cultural contribution, or it's like a polemic and you hate the person. But in this case, I'm assuming you're a fan.
I'm a big fan.
Yeah.
I think he's a great composer, and that's why I wanted to create this website in the first place and write this biography in the first place, because I'm definitely a fan of the man's music. As I'm sure we'll talk about very soon, he is the most famous composer of the classic Godzilla series. He was the composer on the first Godzilla film that came out in Japan in 1954, and he scored many of the subsequent films, going all the way into the 1990s. I mean, he scored the first Godzilla film in 1954. And then scored his last Godzilla film in 1995 with Godzilla vs. Destroyer. So that's literally a career in the realm of Godzilla spanning decades. And that's how I came to even know of his music in the first place, was through watching Godzilla films ever since I was a child.
So in the West, we certainly know, most people are familiar with, if they know about film music, Hans Zimmer or John Williams, or maybe even Bernard Herrmann. And then, there's also, I would say internationally, a lot of love for the Italians. Like, people love Goblin, Fabio Frizzi, and of course the great Ennio Morricone, just winning the Oscar for Best Original Score not too long ago for The Hateful Eight. And that's really cool. But tell me a bit more why you think Japanese film music deserves more love in general.
Well, Japanese cinema is one of the great cinematic traditions in world cinema. Like you're
Hmm.
mentioning Italian films, and you might think of French films, the French New Wave, and
Sure.
Soviet cinema, Russian cinema. But yeah, Japan has one of the great cinematic traditions anywhere in the world. And of course, when we begin to think of Japanese cinema, immediately our minds go to such filmmakers as Akira Kurosawa and so many others. Um, the Japanese are incredibly creative people, I should say, and everything from in the realm of Japanese cinema, you've got these great cinematographers, these great screenwriters and directors, and composers, Japanese music. Yeah, Akira Ifukube is one of these composers that is within people that are film music aficionados. His name is very often mentioned among the likes of John Williams and Ennio Morricone, whom you have mentioned. He's just one of these iconic composers that did something I think that is very difficult for a composer to do, is to create a sound that when you hear it, within a few notes or a few bars of the music precisely who it is. I think that's the mark of a fantastic composer, is when you hear the music begin to play and immediately, oh yeah, that's John Williams. I can tell that's a John Williams melody, or that orchestration sounds like something John Williams would do. John Williams is one of those composers. I think among American composers, Danny Elfman is
Mm.
definitely a composer that when you hear his music, there's something about the way he constructs his melodies, or the way that the music is orchestrated. You just hear something there and you say, oh yeah, that's Danny Elfman. Ifukube is one of these composers. He was very adept at creating a sound that is just so him. And not only is the sound very original, but he was a master at orchestration. His orchestration is very different from like a John Williams. John Williams' orchestration is very in the late romantic vein. You might think of composers such as Mahler or Holst or someone like this. These very rich, lush orchestral sounds. Ifkube's tendency in orchestration is the sound that always, or the word that always comes to mind for me is like monolithic or granitic.
Hmm.
His orchestral sounds tend to be not very lush. They sound very hard and very thick. And as well, the man had a great penchant for writing very, very beautiful melodies. Yeah, he's just, and I think that's one of the reasons why he's so well admired, is because he is an original, and he was one of those composers that just had that knack to create a sound that was entirely his own.
Very cool. Okay, so let's rewind into his personal biography. So before Ishiro Honda, before Godzilla made his first roar, how did Akira get into film composing?
Okay, well, we'll start at the beginning, which is always a good place to start.
Hmm.
The Akira Ifukube was born on May 31st, 1914, on the northernmost Japanese island of Hokkaido. Hokkaido then, as today, is considered to be something like the last frontier of Japan. It's a island that is very mountainous, very wooded. It's really something of a primeval. You might think of forests and this great northern expanse. That's Hokkaido. It's probably the least developed of all the Japanese islands. And the young man, when he was growing up, he was from a very early age interested in music. He was fascinated by Japanese folk songs. He heard those all around him in the village where he grew up. He was also interested in Western classical music. He loved collecting recordings of all the great Western composers, all the great Western musicians, particularly violinists. And he was also interested in the music of the Ainu people. Now, the Ainu are an indigenous people that live in northern Japan, in Hokkaido primarily, and to some extent, at least in the past, they were also found in the Russian Far East. So as a youngster, fascinated by music, he heard these three very different musical traditions: Western classical music, Ainu music, and Japanese music. And these three traditions kind of entered into his brain and swirled around in there, and it made him want to learn how to not only play music but compose music. So in the 1930s, when he was a teenager, he began trying his hand at composing original music. He was more or less completely self-taught. Growing up in this remote area of Japan, he certainly did not have access to music lessons and music teachers. So he began to collect scores and read scores, study the scores, and that's, in a nutshell, how he learned how to become a musician. And in the 1930s, he began writing original orchestral pieces, and these pieces began to be known. There was a competition in 1935 put on by a Russian composer called Alexander Cherepnin, who was interested in composers from Asia, and Cherepnin sponsored this competition in Paris, France, for young Japanese composers to submit an original composition. And he submitted a piece of music called Japanese Rhapsody, which is a piece of orchestral music, two sections, two music, that is based on traditional Japanese music. And this piece of music was submitted to the Cherepnin competition and unanimously won. And that's kind of the moment that put him on the map, is because now that this piece of music won this competition, one of the awards for winning was actually to have the piece published. So throughout the 1930s and the 1940s, Ifukube was a composer of concert music, orchestral pieces. And then after the end of the Second World War, his very close friend, whom he grew up with, Fumio Hayasaka, was already living in Tokyo working as a film composer for the Toho studios. And if any of your listeners are familiar with the name of Fumio Hayasaka, he was Akira Kurosawa's composer of choice on Kurosawa's earlier films in the 1940s and 1950s. Hayasaka's most famous film scores for The Seven Samurai. Anyway, Hayasaka invited Ifukube, well, why don't you move from Hokkaido down to Tokyo, come join me in Tokyo, and you can write music for films. Ifukube agreed. So in 1947, he moved to the main island of Japan and scored his first film, Toho production, called Snow Trail. In 1949, he scored a film for Akira Kurosawa called The Quiet Duel. It's the one and only film score that he did for Akira Kurosawa. And all the while, he's gaining this reputation within the Japanese film industry as being a very talented composer. He was certainly by the early 1950s increasingly in greater demand. And then when the time came for the production of the original Godzilla film in 1954, he was more or less handpicked by the film's producer, Tomoyuki Tanaka, because Akira Ifukube's sound was known for being very big and even a little bit on the dark side. The types of melodies that he wrote were based on modal scales, scales from Japan and in Eastern Asia, and they have a little bit almost of a melancholy to them. So I think Tomoyuki Tanaka, as they were developing the Godzilla story, as they were developing the film, who should compose this? Well, Ifukube would have been the natural choice because he's got that big sound that is just so appropriate for Godzilla, and also that little touch of melancholy and tragedy, because the first Godzilla film in 1954 is a rather dark and serious affair. If your listeners have not seen the original Godzilla film from 1954, the original Japanese version, it's quite different from the later films that tend to be known for their cartoonishness or their silliness. The first film is a very noirish, dark film, and Ifukube's music was just perfect for that type of production.
All right, and can you've got in depth quite a bit, but I'm going to give you another opportunity to just explain his sound, his aesthetic.
Okay, well, as I mentioned, in his mind, growing up, he was exposed to three different kinds of musical traditions, and he absorbed a little bit of everything from each and every single one of them. As I mentioned, he was fascinated by Western classical music. He was really, really interested, first and foremost, in not German composers, your Bach and Beethoven, Mozart, composers from the Austrian and German traditions. He was interested in composers, say, from Russia or France, because he thought that Russian and French composers, they didn't feel held down to create music, to emulate the music that came out of Germany. He thought there was a lot more artistic freedom and creativity within the compositions of Russian and French composers. So he was quite interested in composers like Maurice Ravel, Claude Debussy, and most likely above all, Igor Stravinsky. Igor Stravinsky was a Russian composer who, if any of you have ever seen the Walt Disney film Fantasia, the music that you hear during the dinosaur scene, that's Stravinsky's music. That's adapted from a 1913 ballet that he wrote, The Rite of Spring. And in The Rite of Spring, it's based on a sacrifice ceremony from pagan Russia. So the orchestral sound and the rhythms are often very, very, very barbaric and driving and bombastic. And he was really influenced by The Rite of Spring. He was really influenced by that music. He thought that the primitivism of Stravinsky was something that he wanted to absorb into his own style. So his music is often very redolent of The Rite of Spring, with the percussion and the rhythms, with the irregular rhythms. And this is going back to his fascination with the Ainu music, this music of this indigenous population that he heard. So I think what he was doing in fashioning his sound was to create a sound that didn't sound European. And in fact, he said that very explicitly in interviews. When he wrote music, he didn't want it to sound European. He wanted the music to sound Eastern or Asian, to be evocative of something outside of the hegemonic influence of Western classical music. So his sound is something. There's a writer, a Japanese film or music critic called Shuhei Hosokawa, who once described Ifukube's sound as primitivism nationalism, and I think that's a very apt and concise way to describe the sound. Primitivism, because of the use of barbaric rhythms, barbaric percussion, very big, grandiose sound, a lot of snarling brass, very, very big, gruff sound. And nationalism, because what he's trying to do is he's trying to evoke a sense of the national, a Japanese sound, an inherently Japanese sound, or an inherently Asian sound. And as I mentioned earlier, his use of modes. Now, I won't get too much into music theory here, but I'm sure most of the people in your audience have heard of major and minor scales. In Western music, we have scales that are either said to be major or minor. Major scales sound happy, minor scales sound sad. His practice was not to use European major or minor scales, but modal scales. Modes are other types of scales that go back all the way back into antiquity, and there are certain modes that are shared by various folk music traditions all over the world. One of his favorite modes to use was the Phrygian mode. The Phrygian mode is a type of scale that is found all over in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, in Central Asia, in East Asia. So he uses these types of scales in order to endow his music with a sound that sounds Eastern or Asian, not European.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting stuff. So what are some of his great scores beyond Godzilla?
Well, there are many. He wrote around and about, there isn't an exact number, but around and about 300 film scores. So he wrote quite a few. Of course, his Godzilla scores are among his best. And by the way, he said that his favorite films to score were the Godzilla films and the monster films and the science fiction films that were produced by Toho. So those were his favorites. I would say, well, for me, his best film score, full stop, is the first Godzilla film from 1954. I would say his other monster scores from the early 1950s are among his best. If your listeners are familiar with films like Rodan or The Mysterians, these are other monster and sci-fi spectaculars that Toho produced at the time. Um, he was also the composer of a very famous film series called Zadowichi, and Zadowichi is a blind swordsman. He's sort of a he became this film character became almost like a character of mythical proportions in Japan. He's a blind swordsman who travels all throughout Japan, not necessarily looking for trouble, but always seems to get into it. Played by the great actor Shintaro Katsu, and these are Japanese swordplay films. They call it chambara in Japanese, and his Ifukube scored many of these Zadowichi films that are very, very well known, and many of those scores are quite good. His scores for the Daimajin films, which, again, I'm not sure if your listeners are familiar, but the Daimajin films were produced by another Japanese studio called Daiei. And these are sort of like monster films or combinations of samurai and monster films. Majin is this large stone god that comes to life if the villagers are having a hard time with these samurai lords that come in and seek to enslave them and exploit them, the local villagers pray to this stone god who comes to life and saves the village. He's sort of like a Japanese golem figure. Ifukube's scores for the Daimajin films are also very, very impressive. But I would say, his monster scores are certainly the most well known. And yeah, the first Godzilla film, it's really a masterpiece. It's such a moody and dark score, something so atypical, I think, for a monster movie of the early 1950s. He avoided a lot of the tropes of what we might expect a science fiction film from the early 1950s to sound like, with theremins and all sorts of far out sounds that sound very, very dated. If we go back and hear a few of those scores nowadays, I mean, it's truly a timeless score. It is just as beautiful and striking today as it was then, and I think that bespeaks quite a bit of the great talent of this particular composer.
Yeah, I didn't know about Zadowichi. I love that box set. That was a fantastic one Criterion put out.
Yeah, exactly. The Zadowichi films are available in a beautiful box set from the Criterion Collection, and Akira Ifukube scored the first film in that series, and then several of the sequels. And the actor that plays Zadowichi, Shintaro Katsu, he and the composer were actually very, very good friends. Katsu was himself a musician. He was a singer, and he also played the shamisen. The shamisen is a plucked string instrument, and Ifukube thought that Katsu was a very naturally talented musician, a great instrumentalist as well as singer, and they actually had a very good relationship when they were making those films together. They were quite good friends, actually.
Yeah, 25 movies, which he had in the set. And then there's the 26th movie, which is not in the set. They did a TV show, like 200 episodes, and a Takashi Kitano remake. That's a lot of Zadowichi.
Yeah, but that's going back to what we were just talking about, is that the character of Zadowichi is extremely popular in Japan. Mm-hmm. I mean, the fact that they made so many of those films, and often they made more than one Zadowichi film in 1 year. I mean, they literally were cranking those out to meet the demands of the movie-going public in Japan who loved these films. And then Katsu, when the film series was over, Katsu basically took the character and produced the television show that you mentioned. Ifukube did not work on any of the television shows. He did some limited television work over the span of his career, but really nothing of great note to speak about here. He didn't like working in television anyway. He felt that his sound was much more appropriate for the big screen.
And of course, Katsu Productions behind the great Lone Wolf and Cub series, and that music as well has got is very distinctive. I would say, sort of that sort of more psychedelic rock sort of Japanese interpretation.
Yeah, and going back to our earlier discussion about Japanese composers, I mean, Ifukube's style is very what we might consider to be more classical. But there are any number of there's such a wide prism, a wide spectrum of these composers from this golden age of filmmaking in Japan. You have everything from the more traditional or classical style of Ifukube to the psychedelic kind of far out stuff that you hear in Lone Wolf and Cub, and even within the Godzilla series. I mean, the Godzilla series has had any number of really talented, great composers aside from Ifukube that have worked on those films, and that's a discussion in and of itself, perhaps for another time. Just how each of these different composers made their own individual contributions to the series aside from Ifukube.
Yeah, it was really cool. I agree. The 1954 theme that's the piece of music that people are going to hear and go, oh yes, I know that tune, whether they know it consciously or unconsciously. And they use it in the 80s and 90s Godzilla movies. So in Japan,
they do. And they do. And what's interesting about that, that theme that you're talking about is the ba da 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 da. Everybody knows that, and it's that the first appearance of that theme, as we know it today, is from the 54 film. But what's interesting about that theme is that it was not intended to be the theme of the monster himself. It's actually sort of like a military retaliation theme. When the military is dispatched to fight against Godzilla, that's when you hear the music in the context of the film. I mean, you hear it during the opening credits, but actually in the film, that music is heard to accompany the military.
Huh.
And what is so fascinating about that is that despite that, it's like an earworm. The music is just so catchy. Once you hear it, you can't get it out of your head.
Mm-hmm.
People didn't necessarily, moviegoers didn't make that connection. They didn't make the connection, oh, that's the music for the military fighting Godzilla. Moviegoers said, no, that's in their heads. They said, that's the music for Godzilla. And it became so overwhelmingly attached to the monster himself, even though the theme was not intended for the monster. The composer later, after the fact, made it the monster's theme because he wrote a different theme for the monster, for Godzilla. You can hear it in the original 54 film when Godzilla is attacking Tokyo. It's this very simple rising melody, very imposing. Ifukube uses it again in the second Godzilla film that he scored, King Kong vs. Godzilla. He does a variation of that same simple rising theme for the monster, but because it became so associated with the monster that when the composer came back in the 1990s to score the so-called Heisei era films, he used that music to represent the monster himself. So that's a great case of how the public actually had a great hand in taking that theme and associating it to the monster, something the composer really never intended.
Well, it's interesting what you're saying about the military. What do you think of the reading that Godzilla is like a manifestation of like some sort of comeback after Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Well, I think the most popular and widespread interpretation of the film is that Godzilla is a visual representation of the horrors of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. He is the bomb incarnate. If we could somehow visualize what the evils of nuclear power would look like, it would look like this massive monster Godzilla. I think that's a valid interpretation, and more or less it's the interpretation that the filmmakers, especially the director Ishiro Honda, was going for. I think that the filmmakers were very explicit in that, and as well, when you watch the film, I mean, it's the symbolism, the metaphorical thrust of the film is so unsubtle that anyone paying attention would very easily come to that conclusion. I think, though, that there are other ways to interpret the monster, and certainly the composer himself had an interpretation that, in many ways, is quite different from Honda's. This idea that Godzilla is the bomb incarnate. For the composer Akira Ifukube, Godzilla was something quite different. Now, before I explain that, let me go back in time a little bit. As I mentioned, during the 1930s and the 1940s, the composer Ifukube was writing a slew of concert pieces. And one of his duties during the wartime was not only to write music for the Japanese military, which he did. He wrote music such as his naval march, Kishi Mai, in 1943 and others, but he was also engaged by the Imperial Japanese government as a scientist to work on reverse engineering enemy warplanes. And of course, when I mean the enemy from the Japanese point of view at the time, I'm talking about American warplanes and British warplanes. Among other things, he was an expert in the acoustics of wood. And during the war, the composer was using technology, scientific technology, X-ray technology, to look at wooden warplanes that were used by the British. Why would they be doing that? Well, wooden warplanes could avoid radar detection, and the Japanese wanted to find out about this technology and adapt the technology for their own ends. So they hired Ifukube to study the technology used on these wooden warplanes so the Japanese government could, at a later time, adapt it and use it for their own ends. And the composer was using quite a bit of X-ray radiation to study the planes. Unfortunately, because at the time, during the war, wartime rationing and austerities, lead was very expensive and hard to come by, so the composer was using all of these X-rays without a lead protective suit. And at the end of the war, believe it or not, he became a victim of radiation sickness, not from the bombs, not at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he wasn't there, but because of these X-rays he was using studying these planes. So at the end of the war, the composer became sort of embittered because Japan had lost the war. He was certain that Japan could win the war, that Japan could beat the United States. But he became very disenfranchised with technology because the West clearly had vastly superior technology. We had the atomic bombs, and this quickly and decisively ended the war. There was no way, in terms of military tech, that Japan could stand up to the West, to the United States, and also the technology of using technology to study technology irradiated him and made him sick. So at the end of the war, he developed this idea that modern man, by relying too much on technology is something that is destructive. Technology is something that is evil. It either will make you sick or it will kill it can kill hundreds of thousands of people in one go. So when he was assigned to Godzilla, he read the screenplay. His interpretation of it was that Godzilla represented anti-technology and anti-civilization, a theme that he thought was very appealing. Godzilla is this monster who is worshipped as a god on this tiny fictitious island of Japan called Odo Island. The Odo Islanders live a fairly agrarian and traditional lifestyle, both geographically and figuratively far away from metropolitan Tokyo. And they're in touch with the old ways, the old traditions. And part of the way that they stay in touch with the old ways and their old traditions is through their worship of this monster god, Godzilla, who is sort of a god of nature and of an ancient primeval life force that they're still in touch with, a life force that the rest of modern Japan has long forgotten. So when modern man is testing nuclear weapons, this enrages the monster god. The monster god is upset that man is dabbling in such destructive technology, so he rises from the depths to trample Tokyo as revenge or punishment against modern man for their technological transgressions. And the composer said that when he read the screenplay, he got very excited because all of this modern military technology, jets and tanks, they were all none of it could phase Godzilla. Godzilla was completely untouched by any of it. He could swat the plane out of the sky. He could step on the tank. None of it could affect Godzilla at all. And he said that that theme, that thematic to him suggested anti-technology. The very technology that brought Japan to its knees at the end of the Second World War had no effect on Godzilla. Godzilla was much more powerful than any of it. Godzilla, this representation of a natural primeval life force. That was the composer's interpretation of the Godzilla character, which, as we can see, is quite different from the director from director Honda's.
Very cool. So tell me, how long has this site that you've been working on for Akira Ifukube been up, and how long have you been working on this for?
Quite a while, since since 2006.
Oh my God!
Yeah, it's been a while. At the time, well, you see, the composer, as I mentioned, was born in 1914, and he died in February of 2006. He was 91 years old. So I had, in the late 90s, I had wanted to create a website about him because even at that time, I was a big fan of his music, and there just was not a lot of information about him out there. And I wanted to be the guy that could get his name better known in the Western world. And I thought the best and efficient way to do that would be perhaps to create a website, something that anyone from anywhere in the world could access. I didn't have any idea, though, how to purchase a domain name, how to create a site. I had literally no idea how I could do it, or even if I could do it at all, so I never did. When the composer did die in 2006, it really hit me hard. I thought to myself, wow, this great man is gone. I would really just hate to see that, once he's passed on, that, people may forget about him or something like this. So I said, I've got to do something. So I said, well, I don't know how to create a website, but I'm going to. I want to make sure that his memory is preserved. So I created a very crude website. It's still pretty crude today. If you go and look at it, it's actually a fairly, what I might say, old school looking website. I'm still by no means an expert web designer, but I think where the website lacks in sleek modern design, it more than makes up for in the content. But yeah, I started the website then in 2006, and I was very lucky that through my work on the website, I was able to get in touch with the late composer's estate. And the late composer's estate was actually very happy with what I was doing. They were rather impressed that somebody in the United States would want to undertake this project. So they've been very supportive to me over the years, supplying me with all sorts of rare material, photographs that had never before been published, all sorts of tidbits of history and personal information about their father that had never even been revealed in Japan before. And yeah, I mean, I've been working on it since then, and I'm still working on it now. As far as the biography is concerned, I've started at his birth, and I'm up until, I think right now, about 1980. As I mentioned, he dies in 2006, so I do have some more information to add, but I would say the bulk of it is over. In his later life, aside from writing film scores and concert pieces, aside from the writing of these musical works, his life is fairly mundane. He was also working at the time as a instructor at the Tokyo College of Music, so there really isn't a whole lot to write about in terms of his life. The more interesting tidbits of his life I've already covered. Him growing up in Hokkaido, him becoming a composer, him getting involved in the film industry. So I'm hoping that in the next several years I can get the thing finished. I'm also, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a PhD student at the University of California, San Diego. My doctoral dissertation, will actually be on the use of music in Godzilla films. So this composer Ifukube will actually play a very important part in that dissertation too. So my plate is filled for the next several years. I'm going to be working on this dissertation, and then I've got this biography. But this stuff is constantly in my wheelhouse. So yeah, you might say I'm a little bit of a fan of this stuff.
Yeah, maybe. Just there have been a couple of clues. Yeah. So tell me, how important is the work of Steve Reifel to you?
Oh, Steve's a great guy. I really do like Steve. He and as your listeners know, because you recently interviewed Steve, Steve is the co-author along with another fellow called Ed Godzillas. They wrote a very recent and very excellent biography about Ishiro Honda that came out a few years ago. That is absolutely a great work, because it's the first time that anyone has attempted a serious biography about this very important and very famous filmmaker in a language other than Japanese. So yeah, that book is really quite tremendous. And of course, Steve and Ed both worked on the recent Criterion Collection release of all of the Godzilla films from 1954 to 1975. Yeah, Steve and I get along great. My hope is that when my Ifukube biography, if and when it's ready to be published, that it would be a book that could justifiably sit beside his and Ed's book on Honda. I would say that it's similar in scope, and again, their book was the first major non-Japanese book about Honda. Mine will be the first major non-Japanese text about Ifukube. So I hope that the two works will complement each other nicely, and hopefully one day I'd love to see my book sitting on the shelf next to his and Ed's.
That's really sweet. So how would you rank the albums out there of Akira's, or at least which ones are the ones that you would recommend first?
Well, in terms of his film music, and YouTube is great. YouTube is great because you can find almost anything you want on YouTube. So,
right.
It's very easy for me to suggest things nowadays, because when I suggest something, people can go out and hear it. If we were having this conversation 20 years ago, it would have been very, very different, because there was no YouTube. And if you were in the United States, getting a hold of some of his lesser known scores was by no means as easy as it is today. Among his film scores, I would say the first Godzilla film, 1954. Another great film score of his is King Kong versus Godzilla. I really, really, really enjoy that score. But in terms of his concert pieces, his classical music, this is something that I'm very passionate about in my advocacy, because if you like his film scores, you're gonna love his concert pieces. If you like that big, monstrous, exciting bombast of the film scores, you find that in spades in his classical works. His first orchestral work that I mentioned earlier, Japanese Rhapsody, is a very, very exciting work. You can hear that online. You can find that on YouTube. You can also buy it. You can go to eBay and Amazon. You can find these works there. There's a ballet score that he wrote in 1948, called Salome, which is based on the story of Salome from the New Testament of the Bible. Oh, and that's just a fantastic work. It sounds like a score that you might hear in a classic sword and sandals film, but on steroids. Just the big orchestral sound, the percussion, it's very exciting. A lot of very beautiful, exotic melodies. The orchestration is absolutely gorgeous. Great score. Another piece that's also very popular is his one and only symphony. It's called Sinfonia Top Cara. He wrote that in 1954, the same year that he wrote Godzilla. Sinfonia Top Cara is based on the music of the Ainu people, that indigenous people from northern Japan that I mentioned. Very, very exciting score in 3 sections, 3 movements, and that middle section, absolutely gorgeous melody. So what I would recommend, I could sit here all day and list this stuff off and talk about it. I won't. But what I would encourage your listeners to do is just go to YouTube, punch in the composer's name, and there's countless videos of not only his film scores, but his classical music. I think your listeners would be quite surprised by what they hear.
Very cool. Oh my God, what a great interview. That was so interesting, and you're shining a light through your research on a guy that clearly you know what he was writing about, and that you're righting a wrong. So I thank you for that. This show is kind of like an underground show. We kind of like to shine the light on things that people aren't talking about. And you were just a great guest and a great booking. And I want to thank Steve Rifle for recommending you to me. So thank you so much for your time, Eric. Before I let you go, did you get your hands on that Criterion Godzilla box set yet?
Oh yes, I've got it, and believe it or not, I'm still working my way through the discs. I mean, I've already seen these movies a million times each,
Right.
so it's I can't say that I've watched all of them yet. I'm still trying to make my way through them, but the set is really really great. A lot of people were complaining about the packaging. It's too big. It's like a big coffee table book. A lot of people were saying that they were having trouble, storing it on their shelf next to their other Blu-rays and whatnot. I actually, I think it's a pretty cool concept. I think that Criterion really wanted to do something something spectacular for the set, and appropriately so. These are very spectacular films. So I think in terms of the packaging, they did a really great job. I think that the text that Steve Rifle wrote for it, as well as the other smaller bits of text that his writing partner Ed Gottschewski did, all very good. I think a lot of the transfers, a lot of the prints of the films look absolutely great. And for example, I mean, for me, it's worth the price of admission just to have the film Terror of Mechagodzilla on Blu-ray alone. That's one, and also the original Japanese version of King Kong versus Godzilla. Just to have those on Blu-ray is worth the price of admission alone, because those are two of my favorites. And I should mention that included on the set is an interview with the man himself who we've been discussing, Akira Ifukube. So if you're listening to this and you're interested in learning more about him, and you happen to have the Criterion set, on the disc of supplements, there's an interview from 1999 with him on there. Check it out. It's pretty interesting stuff. You can hear about his music from the man himself.
There's also another one on disc 1.
Yes, that is. Oh, you're absolutely
Yep.
right. Thank you for reminding me, because on disc one is basically a rehashing of the release that Criterion did of the first Godzilla film from, I don't know, about not quite 10 years ago now. So you're absolutely right. So you get 2 interviews with the man in the set. So go check them out. They're both very, very good interviews.
All right. Well, Eric, thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.